The Department of Justice is moving to drop its case against Michael Flynn. Flynn served as President Trump's first national security advisor. He was forced to resign 1 month into the Trump administration for misleading White House officials about conversations he had with Russia's then ambassador to the U.S. Flynn later pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about those very same discussions. Flynn moved to withdraw that guilty plea earlier this year. His legal team argued prosecutors acted in bad faith. The Justice Department says it will now drop the case because of, quote, newly discovered and disclosed information. President Trump called Flynn a, quote, warrior Thursday. Last week, Mr. Trump said he would consider bringing Flynn back to a role in the White House. Let's bring in Nancy Cordes and Alayna Treene. Nancy is CBS News chief congressional correspondent, and Alayna is a White House reporter for Axios. Welcome to you both. Alayna, let me start with you. What more do we know about the timing of Thursday's announcement by the Justice Department?
So the timing is definitely interesting because it comes not long after the FBI has released new documents showing that some agents, in interviewing former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, had asked what their goal was in that interview. Was it to get them to lie? Was one of the quotes that we saw in some of those documents, and it's further kind of, shown the White House and some of the president's allies that just furthers their belief that perhaps that there were bad motivations here on the FBI's part in investigating Flynn. Of course, the president himself has been floating a pardon against his former national security advisor. And I think it's also interesting to note that Attorney General Bill Barr earlier this year, back in February, had appointed an outside prosecutor to kind of look at this case. And he did release a statement today saying that given the evidence that he's compiled over the past several months, as well as the new revelations from those released documents that had just been released earlier this week, had contributed to his decision.
Well, in its filing, the DOJ condemned the FBI's handling of Flynn's case. Is there a sense in the White House, Alayna, that the president and those close to him are growing frustrated with the FBI and its director, Chris Wray?
Yes. So as we have reported at Axios, the president himself, as well as a lot of his top allies, not just within the administration, but also on Capitol Hill, have been growing increasingly doubtful of the FBI's motivations. There's always been this sort of distrust from within the Trump administration and among his fiercest defenders with the FBI. But now there's also this growing distrust generally with FBI Director Christopher Wray. And of course, the president did appoint Director Wray himself following the firing of former Director James Comey. So a lot of questions around that. Our reporting indicates that the president, despite his growing distrust with Christopher Wray, Attorney General Bill Barr has said that he should wait on making any decisions of whether to let him go or to fire him. So as of now, any kind of speculation over whether Wray is going to be removed is definitely, well-founded, but doesn't seem likely in the coming weeks.
Well, Nancy, let me turn to you. What kind of reaction are you hearing from lawmakers about all of this?
Shock and fury from Democrats, Elaine. They say this is yet another example of Attorney General Barr doing the president's political bidding. And we just got a statement a few minutes ago from the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House, Jerry Nadler. He says, quote, the decision to drop the charges against General Flynn is outrageous. The evidence against General Flynn is overwhelming. He pleaded guilty to lying to investigators. Interestingly, we are unlikely to hear much about this from Republicans. Flynn was never really a cause celeb for them. They weren't really pushing for a reversal here, at least Republicans on Capitol Hill. In fact, I think it's likely that the sentiment is going to be dismay that this whole chapter is now being reopened, something that, like the Russia investigation, they thought that they had been able to put behind them.
Well, Alayna, I want to turn to another topic and ask you about a document created by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It provided advice to local leaders on how to reopen businesses and public spaces, but it's not being released. What more can you tell us?
So yes, this document is very controversial within the White House. The Associated Press had broken the news last week that there was a draft of this document going around, and I spoke with some members of the task force, the White House Coronavirus Task Force, earlier today, and they said that draft last week was the first that they have heard of this CDC document. And essentially, the document was providing guidance to different businesses, including schools and daycares and bars and restaurants, about specific ways that they could look at reopening. And the White House ended up weighing in, asking them to revise those guidelines. They thought that it went too far. I think the quote that they used was it was overly specific in what it said. And so they asked them to revise it. As of today and as of this morning, when I spoke with people at the White House, they said that they have not received a revised version. And so those guidelines are being tabled for now.
Well, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi addressed this earlier. How are lawmakers reacting to this news?
Well, Speaker Pelosi was very frustrated by the fact that these guidelines have been shelved. She argued that there needs to be some kind of national standard that governors and mayors can turn to when they're trying to decide how quickly to reopen. She argued that right now, various states are reopening not based on science or data, but based on politics. And she argued that having those national guidelines would help. Now, it should be said that there have been some guidelines put out by the White House saying, for example, that states shouldn't look to reopen until they've seen a downward trend for 14 days. And we know that many states have already ignored those guidelines. So it's not clear that even if these CDC guidelines existed, if they were disseminated to the public, that states and local governments would follow them, simply because there is so much pressure in states like the one I'm in right now, Maryland, to get at least some segments of social life, some segments of the economy back open.
Well, Alayna, you recently looked at the impact the coronavirus is having on stimulus funding, such as the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program. What did you find?
So if you look at the bill, so the main CARES Act, which was passed back in March, of course, they passed an interim bill more recently to replenish some of the funds that had been depleted. But that general $2.2 trillion massive relief package, a lot of those funds are going to be running out soon, or some of the guidelines within that package are going to expire. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said that a lot of what's in that bill is only expected to last for 10 weeks. The Paycheck Protection Program, which is for small businesses, once you apply, the guidelines in that, which are maintain that if you're going to receive these loans, you have to ensure that you're fulfilling payroll for your employees. Those guidelines only legally bind these businesses to do so for 8 weeks. And so we're going to start seeing some of those guidelines, or some of those guidelines to lift within in the next few weeks, beginning in June, before any other bill. They're working on a Phase 4 CARES 2 Act, as Speaker Pelosi calls it, and they're hoping to pass that in the coming months. But it doesn't seem like that'll happen before a lot of these guidelines run out. So there's a lot of questions about what more aid there will be. There's still a very, Republicans or Democrats are still miles apart on what they want in this next bill. So some of these funds are really going to run out before the problem that they're facing, especially from an economic standpoint, are resolved.
And Nancy, just to follow up here, so where do things actually stand on Capitol Hill in terms of a Phase 4 stimulus package?
Well, the two sides are still extremely far apart, and they are not negotiating, Elaine. You've got Leader Pelosi and her Democratic chairs in the House kind of pushing ahead a sort of go it alone approach. They're not trying to work with the Senate Republicans right now. They want to craft their own package with their own priorities and then sort of present that to the Senate and say, your move. McConnell, on the other hand, he really wants to move slowly. He says that he's not ruling anything out, but that he wants to wait and see where the need is. Pelosi, when we spoke to her today, said she sees need all over the place. She thinks that state and local governments are going to need far more money than the $150 billion that they got in the first package. She wants another big boost for first responders. But the reality is that these two sides are so far apart right now, Elaine, and they're not talking. And so if you're a business owner and you're wondering if there's going to be, for example, another pot of money being put into the PPP program, or you're a governor and you're wondering if you're going to have more aid coming your way and when, there are no answers out there for you right now.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable to think, how can planning possibly even begin for some of these folks who are watching to see what develops out of Washington. Alayna, I want to ask you about another bit of news coming out of the White House. The White House says that a U.S. service member who works there tested positive for the coronavirus, and there are reports the individual is a personal valet to President Trump. What more are you hearing about this?
So the personal valet is a very senior member of the military, and normally their duties are to help with the president's wardrobe and help really, they have very close contact, I should say, with the president and the first family, and he's tested positive for the virus. I've talked with other officials within the White House and within the West Wing, and they're not actually as concerned as I think many people would expect for someone within the White House grounds to have tested positive for the virus, mainly because he doesn't really, this person doesn't really interact a lot with White House staff, more so just with the president and the first family. And the president has said today that both he and Vice President Mike Pence have been tested since learning of this valet having tested positive, and both of their tests came back negative. And so the president said in the Oval Office this afternoon that the White House, which has been testing its staff every week, they're going to start moving to testing every single day, and hoping that will prevent this in the future.
All right. Well, Alayna, I also want to ask you about a piece your colleagues at Axios wrote. In it, a senior administration official says they expect the president to begin publicly questioning the coronavirus death toll. First, help us fact check the idea that the death toll is exaggerated. And second, why is this a strategy that the president might pursue?
So the notion that the death toll is being inflated, as the president and some of his advisors believe, there's no evidence to support that. And I've spoken with a lot of public health officials, public health experts, as well as expert reporters on my team and at Axios, and there's just no reason to believe that that's true. Now, what the president believes and what officials have told us is that they think that some of the cases and some of the numbers that we've seen reported of the death toll include presumptive coronavirus cases, and that's why they think perhaps it's higher than it is in reality. But so far, if anything, the evidence actually points that there are more cases and more deaths than due to coronavirus than we've been able to report, given the lack of testing that we've seen around the country.
Nancy, the Trump administration has recently escalated its rhetoric against China over the country's handling of the coronavirus outbreak. Are congressional Republicans in lockstep with the administration on this?
Yes and no. We saw a lot of tough talk from congressional Republicans Thursday on China. You had the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, announcing on the Senate floor that they're going to take up a bill condemning China for human rights abuses. That was new. And on the House side, Leader McCarthy, the top Republican in the House, saying that he's forming a task force with named a number of Republicans who are going to be working solely on China issues. And so, yes, they're trying to match the president's tough talk on China, trying to show some solidarity. On the other hand, they are not willing to go to some of the places that he has gone, particularly when it comes to the origins of the coronavirus. You've heard the president, some of his allies insist that there's plenty of evidence that the virus originated from a lab in Wuhan. I asked the majority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, about that a couple of days ago. He refused to go as far as the president had. He said, there's still so much we don't know. What's clear is that China hasn't been transparent and that put us behind the 8 ball, but he was not willing to go as far as the president has gone to actually accuse China of somehow manufacturing the coronavirus or letting it escape from a lab. Another big area of disagreement between congressional Republicans and the president is that for quite a long time, congressional Republicans have wanted to go after China, or at least condemn it for human rights abuses. That's something that the president has always shied away from. But now they're going to be putting more pressure on him to do just that with this bill that they're considering passing in the Senate.
All right. Alayna, President Trump said Wednesday his administration will continue with its efforts to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. CBS News has learned that numerous senior administration officials are urging the president to reconsider his position. What are you hearing about that, and what are some of the concerns from within the administration?
So one of those officials that is concerned about totally dismantling every aspect of the Affordable Care Act is Attorney General Bill Barr. And we've seen President Trump listen to him and heed his advice in the past. So it'll be interesting to see whether the president sways on this. But there's been concern for a very long time, for several months now, about the political implications of the Affordable Care Act. The president himself has long believed that Republicans have made a promise and have said for more than 10 years now that they wanted to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, and the president believes that it's his job under his watch to make sure that that happens. Others believe, and this is, again, one of the opinions of Attorney General Bill Barr, that especially during a pandemic that we're seeing right now and dealing with the coronavirus, many people will be left, very confused and with less options if they fully dismantle it during a pandemic. And so those are questions that they're still debating. I've been told that there was a meeting at the Oval Office earlier this week, and that it basically ended up as status quo. There's still disagreement on it, and so I think that's one that we'll have to continue watching.
Well, Nancy, what impact could this have on Capitol Hill?
Well, Democrats are already ramping up for this fight. They think that healthcare was a winning argument for them in 2018, that it helped them win back the House, and they think that it'll be the same in 2020, especially if the administration is still pushing to repeal the Affordable Care Act in the middle of a pandemic. They will point out that the White House, while the president has said over and over again that he wants to replace the Affordable Care Act with something better, the White House has never put forth a plan for what its alternative would look like. And so what they will argue heading into an election year is that the White House wants to take away coverage, it wants to take away protections for pre-existing conditions, and it has no plan to replace those protections that millions of Americans rely on. So that's the fight that will take place. But I'll tell you that beyond the political argument here, there are many lawmakers who I've spoken to who are genuinely concerned about what would happen if the ACA were to be struck down at exactly a time when so many Americans who rely on it need it the most and would have a very difficult time, especially because they're out of work, temporarily unemployed, furloughed, might have a very difficult time finding alternative insurance.
All right, Nancy Cordes and Alayna Treene, good to see you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alayna.